The name of our veteran is Mark Belafsky. He was born on June 8, 1939. He served in the Vietnam War as part of the U.S. Army. The highest rank he achieved was captain. This interview is taking place on the 23rd of November, 2015 in Davis, California. The interviewer's name is Jocelyn Cavens, and she doesn't have a relationship with the interviewee. The people present for and assisting in the interview are Ophir Safan, Nicholas Burns, Peter Conan, and Aidan Mager. This interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress. Okay. Where were you born?
Perth Amboy, New Jersey.
And what was your family like growing up? What did your parents do for a living? How many siblings did you have?
I was born in 39. My sister was born in 41, all in Perth Amboy. My father was a physician. My mother was a housekeeper. In those days, women going to college was very rare. My father left for World War II in 1942 and didn't come back until 1946, so my sister and I essentially grew up without a father for those early years.
And what were you doing before you entered the service?
I was a physician in training at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia.
And how old were you when you entered the service?
23 and a half.
And besides your father, did you have any other family members who served in the military?
Yes. My brother-in-law was also in Vietnam, and all my father's, and my mother's brothers were in World War II.
And what was it like being drafted?
Terrible. I wasn't going to get drafted. The climate for physicians was different then. This was the first time since World War II that there had been a doctor draft. And there was a senator from Virginia, I think, by the name of Berry, who came up with what has since been called the Berry Plan, which means that the military decided, all branches, decided how many doctors they would need 2 years down the pike, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, etc. And they counted the ones that they were training themselves, although in those days there were very few military training programs. And then you applied for a deferment to finish your training in the specialty of your choice. If the military needed, say, 1,000 urologists, and there were 2,000 applying for the Berry Plan, then 1,000 obviously didn't get and got drafted, and the 1,000 who did were allowed to finish their deferment, their training, and then they were taken in the service for their 2 years. That's the way it works. So the Berry Plan was active in all specialties. If you didn't elect to apply for the Berry Plan, then you were draft eligible just by a lottery number. And well, it's not really a mistake. My specialty at the time was heart surgery. I was in my second year of a 5-year program to be a heart surgeon. And this was at the beginning of cardiothoracic surgery. There were no open hearts being done. The heart-lung machine had just been invented 3 years previously at Jefferson, by the way. And the military did not need heart surgeons. So they put me in the draft. Now, a little cute aside, my father at the time was playing cards on a weekly basis with the governor of New Jersey. So I was darn sure I wasn't going to get drafted. I had influence, right? Wrong. Got drafted.
So what was your reaction when you were drafted?
It wasn't bad. This was in 1966. The Vietnam War hadn't really started yet. We only had advisors there. Kennedy had only sent Special Forces advisors. The country was for the war at that point in time. We all thought that by getting there and stopping the communists from taking a foothold in South Vietnam, we would keep them off American shores. So it was very positive. I was going over there to do a good thing.
Who did you tell first?
My wife.
And what was her reaction like?
She cried. She was unhappy. She was pregnant with our first child.
So how much time did you have between being drafted and going to serve?
Let's see, about 4 months.
So if you hadn't been drafted into the war, do you think you would have enlisted?
No.
Why?
Why put myself in harm's way if I didn't have to?
So what were your feelings on the war before being drafted? You said the country was pro-war, but were you?
Yes. My wife and I were both pro-war. And once we got over the initial shock, we were both happy that I was going to go help out.
Before you were drafted, did you feel like you knew a lot about the war?
No, but I read up on it.
Did you go to a training camp?
Interesting. There's a boot camp, a 6-week boot camp for physicians at Fort Sam Houston in Texas. But at the beginning of the war, when they first started the troop buildup in '65, they needed physicians so badly that they never sent me to Fort Sam. They sent me right to my first duty station in Los Angeles.
Did you receive any specialized training before you went?
No.
And how was transitioning from normal life to serving?
A little anecdote. My wife and I were there. We reached our duty point, which was Fort MacArthur in San Pedro, California. It's not there anymore. Fort MacArthur was on the bluff overlooking Long Beach Harbor. It's a peninsula of southern Los Angeles City. And it was built during the war, World War II, to look for submarines, Japanese submarines in the Pacific. So it had these huge gun placements, and it had a hospital. The hospital took care of all military dependents from Southern California, and there were huge military bases in Southern California: Long Beach Naval Station, Camp Pendleton, the Marine Base. We took care of all their wives and kids from those military bases. So it was a very busy hospital.
Did you ever, so after being in Los Angeles, were you ever placed in Vietnam? Did you go?
Yes, they sent me a letter I was there July 1. They sent me a letter in February, and I was in Vietnam in March.
Where specifically in Vietnam were you stationed? I could have gotten the deferment out of Vietnam, backing up a little bit, because my wife was pregnant. They would have given me a deferment until she was due to deliver, which was 3 months down the pike. But the unit I was assigned to in Vietnam was a surgical unit with only 4 surgeons. And if I delayed that, I could have wound up as a field medic, jumping out of helicopters and landing in the rice paddies and things like that. So I decided to go with the hospital, which I felt would be safer. So can you describe like the specific place in Vietnam you were stationed?
The-
What was it like?
Vietnam, the southern part of Vietnam is all Mekong River Delta. It's all waterways and marshland and swamps and land. Saigon is the biggest city down there. As you go further north, it gets into the mountains. And the central highlands of Vietnam are named that because of the mountain chain that's there. Well, the mountain chain was a home to all the communist guerrillas. So that had not yet been attacked by the U.S. and its allies. So we, as a hospital unit, were assigned to take care of the 1st Air Cavalry Division as they landed on the coast in a town called Quy Nhon and pushed west through the mountains until the border.
So did you travel with them, or were you stationed in one place?
No, they stationed us in one place. They found a town called Pleiku, which was a little bit to the west of the center of the country. They cleared off a mountaintop with Agent Orange and bulldozers, and they plucked down our hospital in the middle of it. We had about a dozen tents. We had 5 physicians, 2 orthopedic surgeons, 2 general surgeons, which I was one, and an anesthesiologist. We had about 20 male nurses, no females. We had a whole bunch of corpsmen. We had a lab. We had a primitive X-ray unit. Had a laundry. Had a sterilizing tent. everything in the hospital needed. It was just like the MASH hospitals that you saw from the Korean War. Probably the same tents that they had stored.
So had you ever traveled to different parts of the country before, or different countries, and how did that compare to your experience traveling to Vietnam?
The only time I'd been out of the country was to the Caribbean with my parents. And then my wife and I drove cross-country from Philadelphia to get to California. So that was the only traveling I'd ever done.
So was it a sharp contrast?
Oh, yeah. You leave San Francisco in March when it's chilly and cold, and you arrive in 120-degree temperature, raining. Big contrast.
How did you get to Vietnam?
On a civilian Pan Am jet from San Francisco, from Travis Air Force Base.
So what was that experience like?
A whole bunch of single guys, a whole bunch of military people. Pan Am was a big civilian transport. And even during the war, there were civilian airliners landing in all the cities of Vietnam. It was a strange war.
So even though you were stationed in one place in a hospital, did you ever witness any action or combat?
Yes. Our hospital unit was mortared frequently. We spent a lot of nights living in trenches. We had only our corpsmen to protect us. The 1st Cavalry soldiers were out in the mountains doing their thing. We had a field team of the 101st Airborne nearby that we visited and did their sick call for them. But that's it. And we went into the town to play coup rarely, although the mayor and his council, if you call it that, came out to visit us for their medical care. So were we in danger? Yes, every night.
And what were your duties?
Our duties were to be in the operating room when the triage patients came in and take care of their problem, as any surgeon would.
So who were your patients?
Young kids like you,
So soldiers?
18, 19-year-old soldiers.
And did you ever interact with any people, like Vietnamese people, or was it just soldiers?
No, we had Viet Cong prisoners that we took care of. As soon as we, well, I'll explain the hospital business a little bit later on, but nobody stayed with us long.
So could you describe like a typical day?
The landing field we had was they have to understand, it's a tropical climate. So the rainy season is 6 months. So it rained almost every day. The airstrip was a metal tarmac, steel sections, maybe 8 by 8 feet, that are interlocking. And they level the ground with a bulldozer. They put these steel tarmac pieces down as a runway. And both the helicopters and the planes took off from that runway. So we would get notice by radio to our triage tent that a helicopter was coming in with injured and what they were, basically. And as soon as the helicopter landed, the corpsman would take them off and bring them into the triage tent. And there the decision was made whether they needed immediate surgery, whether they could wait a little bit, etc. And we saw, by the way, the first 6.5 months we were there, only 4 of us. We saw anywhere between 200 and 300 shot-up kids a week. It was mind-boggling.
So when you interacted with the people of Vietnam, was there a language barrier, and how did you deal with that?
Well, we had a translator. We had a Vietnamese civilian translator in our unit, but we didn't do that too often during those first few months. We were too busy.
And how many men did you work with?
We had 4 surgeons, anesthesiologists. We had about 30 corpsmen, a couple of nurse anesthetists, male nurse anesthetists, and then we had x-ray techs and laundry techs and cooks and whatever it takes to run a little city.
And did you form friendships with any of them?
Yes.
And who was your closest friend during your service?
a fellow from Chicago who I still keep in touch with.
And did you have any officers that you had to listen to every day? Like, were there any people above you who stayed with you?
There was a major who was not a physician, who was the hospital administrator, and he pretty much let us do our thing medically, because the first 6 or 7 months we were there, it was busy every day, and he was responsible just for making sure we had the right equipment, and that the patients were moved in and out quickly, and that the corpsmen did their jobs well. Our interaction with him was terrific. He was very good. He just asked us what we needed, and he went out and did it.
And how did you stay in touch with your friends and family back home?
Didn't. There was no way.
And what did you do for fun when you weren't working?
There was no fun. We weren't allowed cameras. We had transistor radios with only the military radio stations. Had nothing.
Can you tell us a little bit about how the hospital operated?
Yes. Well, I'll show you pictures if you have whole pictures of that. But basically, patients came in off of helicopters. The Vietnam War was the first war that the battlefield injuries, time of transportation from the actual injury to the physician evaluating them, was cut down drastically by the helicopters. There were no helicopters that did that in the Korean War. It was too cold most of the time. But if you were injured in the Vietnam War, your chances of surviving were, I don't know the exact percentages, much better than the Korean War and World War II. And as the future wars went on, Desert Storm and Afghanistan, the percentage you're surviving got even better because the helicopter crews got better, the corpsmen were better trained, etc.
So, where were you when either the war ended or you got to go home?
We were there for exactly 1 year, 365 days. That was our tour of duty. So at the 365th day, I came home back to New Jersey. They gave me 2 weeks, and this was in March. I did not get released from active duty until July, so they sent me to be chairman or chief of the emergency room at Fort Dix in New Jersey, which was a huge basic training base.
And how did you get home?
Same, Pan Am.
And what feelings were you feeling when you were on that plane back home?
Relief. Going to see my wife and my daughter for the first time. She was 9 months old when I first saw her.
So what was that like, coming home to your family and friends after your service?
It was terrific. My wife, when I married her, was an orphan, so she moved in with my parents when I left. So it was just coming home to one big love fest.
And did they know, like, could they expect when you were going to be home, or did you get to surprise them?
No, I called.
And what was it like having to transition back into your normal life?
It was easy.
Yeah.
It was easy. The Vietnam veterans, while not treated well by the public, were treated very well by the physicians and by the medical establishment. So it was easy.
So when you say that Vietnam veterans weren't treated well by the public, what do you mean by that?
Well, the war in 71, 72 became very unpopular. Vietnamese veterans coming home with uniforms on were cursed at, they were spit at, they were thrown things at, they were called child killers. It was not a fun time.
And did you personally experience any of that?
Yes.
And have you stayed in touch with any of your friends from the service? I know you mentioned one.
Just that one. I occasionally saw a corpsman who was with us, who was at our local hospital in New Jersey, working in the emergency room, but that's about it.
And how did you become such good friends with this one person?
Just from daily interaction.
Are you active in the military or veteran community now? So for example, like, are you a member of any veteran organization?
No.
Is there a reason for that?
Well, when I was in practice, I had no time. And now that I'm retired, I just never got interested.
So can you talk about a little bit more like what it was like coming back home, what the experience was, like because the environments were so contrasting?
Well, the last 4 months of our tour in Vietnam, we were pretty well shell-shocked from seeing all those injured kids for 7 months. So they replaced us with another surgical team, and they moved us back to a large established hospital. And we were essentially extra baggage there. So we had very little to do because the hospital already had its complement of surgeons. So luckily it was an evacuation point for soldiers, so we traveled. We spent a lot of time traveling. We went to Japan, we went to Cambodia, we went to the Philippines. They'd give us, the CO of the base was very nice to us. He knew what we had done for 7 months, and he helped us every time we could. So the last 4 months, we'd all decompressed. So coming home was a pleasure. It wasn't that much of a change from what we were doing. It's not like we were operating on injured people one day and home the next day. We had a 3 or 4 month decompression period there that was well, not only deserved, but taken very nicely.
So during your service, did you ever deal with the after effects of Agent Orange?
Yes. I myself developed a cancer in 1998 that was Agent Orange related. And because of that, the government still gives me disability.
So when you were traveling, what was Cambodia like, and was there any military presence there?
Did I say Cambodia? I meant Thailand.
Oh.
Yeah, Cambodia was off limits, although my brother-in-law did go, but that's another story. Thailand was beautiful. We had, there was a military hospital there, an army hospital there. So once we got there, we were well accepted, and they just showed us around. It was beautiful. We went to all the ruins and were able to eat out on the economy. It was almost like being at home. Same with Japan and the Philippines.
So why was Cambodia off limits for you?
Well, even though they were friendly, the military did not want any U.S. soldiers there for some reason. I don't know why. The Ho Chi Minh Trail ran right through Cambodia. And the capital, I don't know why the military didn't want us there, but they didn't. They let us go to Thailand easily because there was a military hospital there. But there was no U.S. military presence in Cambodia. That's probably why.
So while you were traveling, what did you do? Did you see any patients, or were you just
No.
there to visit?
Just pleasure trips.
Mm-hmm. And from your service, do you have any memorable patients? Like any patients that really stick out with you?
I have one. Although if he heard me tell a story, I won't mention names. There was a war correspondent who was injured. He was shot in the chest, and he came to our hospital like any soldier would. He was out in the field, and he was recovering. He had his chest tube in. 2 days after he arrives, his mother from Washington shows up in the middle of our hospital, in the middle of Pleiku. As I mentioned before, the civilian airliners were still flying into all these countries, into all these cities. She came over on Pan Am, took a small commercial liner from Saigon to our town, and was there with her son. Now, the reason she was there, as we found out, was that her son, from his time in Saigon, had a Vietnamese girlfriend. And she did not want him involved with this Vietnamese girlfriend. So she came there to make sure that he didn't go back to Saigon with her and to take him home, sort of like dragging him by the scruff of the neck. He turned later on, he turned out to be President Ford's press secretary. So he was politically connected, but still under the thumb of his mother when he was in his mid to late 20s.
So you said you had both American soldier patients and also Vietnamese patients. So
Yes.
how did those interactions differ?
Well, we couldn't talk to them unless through an interpreter. They knew they were prisoners of war, so they didn't want to talk to us. So we basically took care of them, took care of their medical needs, and ignored everything else. They had a separate, small little part of the tent to themselves. They were guarded 24/7. And basically, as soon as they got better, they were shipped out to the Vietnamese hospital in Saigon.
So how did the men within your unit feel about treating these Vietnamese patients?
I'm sure that some of them didn't like it, but they went ahead and did it. It was their orders.
And did the locals in Vietnam seem to be okay with what you were doing, or what was their reaction to you like?
You couldn't tell. Some of the locals put on a good show during the day. That was a problem with this first guerrilla war that we ever encountered as a country. Locals were friendly during the day. At night, they go underneath their hooches into their cellars, pick up their guns, and go fight with the communists. So you didn't know who was friendly and who was not, because the communists and the enemy and the Viet Cong looked just like the civilians.
Did you ever have a non-friendly interaction yourself with anybody?
No.
And so you said that you received an injury during your service that wasn't recognized by the military until later on.
Well, there were 5 diseases that were life-threatening that the military did not recognize as being related to Agent Orange until the mid-1990s. That was 20 years after the war, if not more. The reason was there hadn't been any research on these diseases, and it took that long to come up with the epidemiological data. But once they did, they realized that prostate cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is what I had, a certain skin cancer, and a couple others were all caused by Agent Orange.
And so how did that feel to have your disease not be recognized by the military?
Well, by the time I got sick, it had been. It had been recognized for 2 years. So they gave me disability, no questions asked. The percentage of disability depended on the extent of the illness. So my disease stage was stage 4, which is pretty far advanced. So they treated me, and I'm very lucky to be here. But because of that, I'm 100% disabled according to the government. Do I look disabled? No. Do I feel disabled? No. But that's the story.
So you mentioned that both you and your wife were pro-war before you entered the service. Did that ever change with your experiences?
No. No, we just wish that they could have bombed the whole country and covered it in concrete.
Did you ever regret like you said you were happy to be drafted because you wanted to serve and help your country. Did you ever feel less excited to do that, or regret that you had to go and serve?
No, never. And if this had been a World War II type situation, I probably would have enlisted on my own. But this was not. This was a limited war that was limited by the politicians. They did not give the military enough troops or enough money to win it, and we knew that. We knew that all the time we were there. We could see it. So we were pretty disillusioned after a while, but still wished that we could have gone further and they would have gone all out.
And during your service, did you know about Ho Chi Minh?
Oh, yes.
And so how much did you know, and like what were your thoughts about him? Was he ever discussed amongst your unit?
No, we never talked about politics. We knew about the Ho Chi Minh Trail, of course. That was close by to us, by the way.
So did you ever go on that trail?
No.
And did any soldiers who were on it, did you interact with any of them? Did you get to talk about what it was like with them?
Well, we took care of a lot of soldiers who were shot up along the trail, but they never stayed long enough for us to develop a relationship with. our hospital was so small, we did not have any facilities for keeping these patients for any length of time. Once they were stabilized, no matter what their injury, if they had a through and through bullet wound to the thigh that didn't cause any bleeding or any neurological damage, we took care of it immediately, put a bandage on, they were on the next plane out to the next level hospital. The people that required ventilators, et cetera, stayed with us a few days until they could be stabilized enough to transport.
Did you get to see a lot of your patients survive, or how?
Never knew. Never knew what happened. From us, they went directly to the Philippines, to the Air Force Hospital at Clark Air Force Base, which doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately. But we never got any follow-up on them whatsoever.
How did you feel about that? Did you want to be able to know about them?
Yes, but it was impossible. Sometimes on the really injured patients who could still communicate, we give them our phone numbers at home just to call us in a year and let us know how they were doing. But that was purely volitional on our part. It wasn't part of the standard operating procedure.
What was the longest stay that a patient could have at your hospital?
It varied until they were stabilized. I think the longest we had was 10 days.
And did you ever get to know any of your patients?
No. That's not true. I take that back. There was one kid who recognized my name. He was shot. No, he had a punchy stick injury in the foot. You know what a punchy stick is? The communists along these trails in the jungle would dig holes in the ground, 4 by 5 feet, and they'd fill it with bamboo spikes that had been sharpened, pointing straight up. And they'd cover the spikes in human excrement. So when somebody, a soldier, even if he had boots on, fell into this trap, they would get a punji stick with infected material on it into their foot. So this was the punji stick injury, and it was quite common for them to do. So he had a punji stick injury. Why the name punji, I don't know, and was treated successfully and left. But he recognized my name because he lived in a small town where my uncle in New Jersey had a drugstore, and he recognized the name.
So how did that feel to be recognized?
Felt good.
And so why do you think the politicians limited the war efforts?
You'd have to ask John F. Kennedy. He was the one that got us into it. He was the one that ignored all the white papers from his advisors that said you either do two things when you go into this war, you either go all out to win it or you don't go into it at all. And he decided to ignore their advice completely and went in with advisors and social workers, et cetera, et cetera. It was a no-win situation from the beginning.
Do you have any strategies you think that should have been used?
Yeah, not go in. I think that would have been, in retrospect, there were times when we felt we should have just taken all the American troops out and bombed the heck out of the whole country. And as I said before, concrete it over, because we were in a no-win situation. But, you know, the prudent thing to do would be not just to go in at all.
How many of the men that you were serving with did you know previously? Did you
None.
None. And when you were being drafted, did a lot of your friends, were they also drafted? How was that?
No, I was the only one that I knew. Even at my hospital, I was the only one. Everybody else got the Berry plan because their specialty was one that the military needed down the pike.
Do you have any really memorable injuries that you ever dealt with patients, or like any really common ones?
Well, I didn't bring my slides of the injuries. I left the gore at home. But if you're interested, you want to come over one day, I'll show you all my gore. The Plinkett injuries, we call them Plinkett injuries, shrapnel, single gunshot wounds, punji sticks, were the most common. Of course, there were gunshot wounds to vital organs. There were mine injuries, landmine injuries where the legs were blown off. There were chest wounds where we had to open the chest and repair all the non-vital structures in there so the patient could be evacuated. But the bulk of our wounds were non-life-threatening, high-powered rifle, punji sticks, etc., to extremities.
Did seeing all of like the injury and kind of grief that you saw, did that ever change how you felt about being in the war? We know you stayed pro-war, but did you ever have any doubts, or did that ever change the way you were thinking?
No, somebody had to be there to take care of these kids, and I personally was glad it was me.
So many people began to doubt the war, like you said, towards the end. So why specifically did you stay pro-war, and why was that belief so set in stone for you?
Well, we had the pro-war activists, who I later found out when I got home, because we had no communication. We had no newspapers. There was no Stars and Stripes newspaper. There was nothing. There was no internet. There were no cell phones. There was no means of communication. They let us have cameras later on, and I snuck in a little miniature spy camera through one of my Air Force contacts early on. I'll show you some pictures. But most of the academic people I knew from medical school and residency were against the war, although they didn't treat us with any disdain. They treated the politicians with disdain. And the reason they were, I think, that the public was so upset with the war was the fact that we weren't doing it right. We either sent in all the troops necessary to win it, or we got out completely. For instance, the Ho Chi Minh Trail came from North Vietnam, cut over to Cambodia, and down into South Vietnam. They moved armies through that trail. North Vietnamese armies, Viet Cong armies, goods, everything. Our troops weren't allowed to cross that border into Cambodia to stop them. That's the relationship we have with Cambodia. No American military presence in Cambodia was allowed. We weren't allowed to bomb Cambodia. If we could have bombed that Ho Chi Minh Trail, and we had means of doing it, they were bombing the heck out of North Vietnam, it might have been a different war, but the politicians didn't let us. So the public knew that they were holding back, and this was a political war. It wasn't until '72, until the fall of Saigon, that the military finally realized it, I think.
So do you think the opinion of the public would have changed if the war had been fought differently?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You know, the feeling at the beginning of the war was, we must stop the communists from getting into South Vietnam, because the next step, the communists would be on the West Coast. Well, you know, that's a far reach, but they sold it to the public.
So did you think that communism was a good reason to go to war? Did you agree with that?
Well, after what McCarthy had put us through in the 50s, yes, communism was a bad thing. After we saw what was happening in Berlin with the division of the city, yes, communism was a bad thing.
And where were you during the fall of Saigon?
In Philadelphia, my residency.
And how did you feel when you heard about it? What were your reactions?
Sad. Sad for all the wasted lives lost.
And do you remember where you were when you heard President Kennedy was assassinated?
Yes, I was in medical school in Chicago, in OB clinic. Everybody remembers.
And how did that feel?
He was our savior at that time. I mean, everybody in the country was Democratic because of him. Of course, it turned out not to be so, especially with Vietnam, but nobody knew it then.
What kind of impact do you think his death had on the war?
The leader of South Vietnam was a dictator by the name of Diem. Did you go over this with him? He and Kennedy seemed to be in cahoots. And Diem was a brutal dictator. He oppressed religion. He treated his people terribly and was very, very poorly liked by the South Vietnamese. His assassination, which I think may have had some CIA help at the end, came several months before Kennedy's assassination. And I always wonder why nobody either talked about it or discussed it, whether those two were somehow related. Whether somebody who would have been in DM's camp hadn't taken out Kennedy in Dallas. But nobody ever talked about it, nobody ever investigated it, so we'll never know.
Going back to the thinking of like we need to go into Vietnam to prevent communism, what did you think about the domino theory? And did you...
Nobody believed in that. We were sold a bill of goods on that.
So do you think that the reaction to communism was a little hyped?
I think it was. It would have taken a long, long time for a communist army that had conquered South Vietnam to get to our shores, because at the beginning of the war, the North Vietnamese army was not involved. It was purely a guerrilla war. So logistically, it would have been very hard, if not impossible, for them to get here. Whether or not the politicians at the time were worried about Russia getting involved or Chinese getting involved, that's another story.
Did you think that a lot of the American people were really afraid of the spread of communism?
Yes.
And so do you think that the reaction that the public had to the war at the beginning, like why people were pro-war, was because of how scared they were of communism?
Absolutely.
And so you were very pro-war, but you think that the domino theory was a little bit too far-fetched. But you still felt good about going to help your country in fighting communism?
Yes.
So do you have any really vivid memories from your service, like one memory that really sticks out or something that has really stayed with you?
Yes. And it involves the Korean Army. I remember I told you that we were mortared almost every night. Our situation when we were in Pleiku for those first 7 months was not a safe one until the Koreans landed on the South China Sea coast at Quinyan and took over the Americans' responsibility for control of the Central Highlands, freeing the 1st Cavalry Unit to move further north. When the Koreans came, it became immediately safe. And we were on the beach when they came. They sent us to greet them. They were fierce little fighters. And the first thing they did when they got there was catch a couple of guerrillas and skin them alive and hang them from a tree, and they saying that the tigers are here. This was they were called the Rock Army, Royal Army of Korea, the Tiger Division. The Viet Cong then proceeded to capture a couple of South Koreans and skin them and hang them from the tree saying, "Send us more tigers." That's an anecdote of how the war went on. But the Korean Army had female nurses, and the female nurses had separate medical problems than, of course, the male soldiers. So rather than have their doctors take care of their female nurses, they asked us to take care of their female nurses, which we did. So many reasons as you can figure out. So we were invited to breakfast or brunch at the Korean encampment, and this was a whole division. This was a lot of men. And after brunch, they lined up the entire division in formation, and they had convicted a young Korean trooper while he was in the local town. They convicted him of raping a South Vietnamese girl. So the commanding officer, who was a 2-star general, in front of all of us, came out, had this kid kneel in front of him, and he executed him with a .45 to the back of the head. So they did not put up with any shenanigans by their troops, and that was one of my most vivid memories.
What were you feeling in that moment? That must have been pretty shocking.
It was. It was. Now you can see them on video every day from the Middle East, but then it hadn't been done.
And what was the reaction like from the crowd that was watching?
They were silent. They were all military. They knew what was going on.
What happened afterwards? Was there any like talk
Nothing.
about it?
Nope, we finished lunch and went back to our business.
So how does your experience in Vietnam impact your everyday life? Does it have an impact?
It has because of the illness I'm dealing with. I have some complications of the chemotherapy. And it did while I was in training because it helped out my surgical skills immensely. The experience I got there, I couldn't have gotten anyplace else. And I got what very few people did. There were only half a dozen MASH hospitals in there and only a limited number of surgeons that got that experience. So from that standpoint, it was a wonderful, wonderful year for me, medically. And I've carried that over till the time I stopped working.
Did you learn any lessons during your service, like besides just medical training, but did you learn any like life lessons?
Yeah, if you're going to do something, do it right. Don't do it half-butted.
And so where does that lesson come from?
From the politicians running the war, not the military.
And would you say that's the most important message you got out of your service?
Yes.
And do you think the time you spent in Vietnam was worth it?
Politically, no. No. Now that, once I came back safe and had all that experience, it was a wonderful medical experience. Unfortunately, it happened to be on young, shot-up American kids. But it is what it is. You saved a lot of lives.
And so looking back on your service, what kind of impact do you think you made? Are you happy with what you did during your service?
I wonder frequently how many of those names on the wall in Washington that I saw. No way of knowing. But we did a lot of good things there. We saved a lot of lives. We saved a lot of limbs. We did a lot of good things. I'm proud of that.
And do you think overall, do you think America's presence in Vietnam was worth it?
No.
Why?
Didn't accomplish anything. The communists still took over. And by the way, South Vietnam is better for it today.
And is there anything else that you'd like to add to this interview?
I don't think so. You've been very thorough.
Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome.